Hello, everybody, and welcome to this discussion organised by the Constitution Unit on reforming the prerogative. I'm Meg Russell, Director of the Constitution Unit, and I'll be chairing today's discussion. The executive's prerogative powers seem like an obscure topic, but over recent years, and particularly since the Brexit referendum, they've often been at the heart of heated political controversies. From military action under Blair, Cameron and May, to prorogation of Parliament under Johnson, and his subsequent decision to revive the prerogative power of dissolving Parliament for general elections. Today, the Constitution Unit has published a new report on reforming the prerogative. It's freely available from our website, and I think a link should be going into the chat in a moment. And that report itself summarises a new book on this little understood but crucial topic by Robert Hazell and Timothy Foote, both of which were assisted by Charlotte Sayers-Carter. The book is entitled Executive Power, the Prerogative, Past, Present and Future. So this event marks the launch of both of these publications, and we're joined by the lead author on both, Professor Robert Hazell, the founder and former director of the Constitution Unit, who'll quickly summarise the importance of the topic and what the publications focus upon. We'll then hear from three expert commentators who will respond to different chapters in the book and report. Arabella Lang is the head of research at the Public Law Project and will talk particularly about the prerogative in foreign affairs and international agreements, which has become far more crucial as a result of Brexit. Professor Philippe Lagassé from Carleton University in Canada heads a comparative project on prerogative power reform in Australia, Canada, New Zealand and the UK. And he's going to speak particularly about war power. Finally, Sir Peter Riddle is Honorary Professor at UCL. He's a former journalist, former Director of the Institute for Government, and former Commissioner for Public Appointments. He'll talk about the prerogative, particularly regarding public appointments. The panelists are going to speak in that order, taking just around 5 minutes each for their opening remarks. I may then ask a couple of questions to the panel before opening up to the audience for questions. If you're attending this event live and would like to ask the panel a question, please write it in the Q&A function of Zoom as opposed to the chat. Lisa James, our Q&A facilitator, will then select a mix of questions and by default will ask each questioner to unmute themselves and ask their own question to the panel. Alternatively, you can indicate when you submit your question that you prefer Lisa to ask it on your behalf, and also say if you prefer it to be put anonymously. This whole session, including the Q&A, is being recorded and will become a Constitution Unit podcast after the event, as well as being posted as a video on the Constitution Unit website and YouTube channel. You may want to bear that in mind when deciding whether to ask your own question. So that's more than enough from me. Let me pass over to the panel. And Robert, tell us about reforming the prerogative.
Thank you, Meg. I'd like at the start to pay tribute to my two co-authors, Timothy Cook and Charlotte Sayers-Carter, two brilliant young lawyers and superb scholars, and I couldn't have written either the book or the report without them. But let me now try and make 5 quick points in my 5 minutes. First, quickly to define prerogative powers. The prerogative derives from the original executive powers of the Crown. Over the years, these have been overlain and superseded by statute, and most powers have transferred to ministers. But 3 powers still remain with the monarch: the power to summon, dissolve and prorogue Parliament, to grant royal assent to bills passed by Parliament, and to appoint or dismiss ministers. The main prerogative powers now in the hands of ministers are the power to make war and deploy the armed forces, to make and ratify treaties, to conduct diplomacy and foreign relations, to grant peerages and honours, to grant pardons, and to issue and revoke passports. The simple demand of reformers has been to put the prerogative on a statutory basis. And when Gordon Brown became Prime Minister in 2007, he announced wide-ranging plans to reform 10 prerogative powers. These included the war-making power, dissolution and recall of Parliament, ratification of treaties, the rules for the issue of passports and granting of pardons, the appointment of bishops and judges, and the rules governing the civil service. But Brown's bold plans ended in a whimper. Eventually, just 2 reforms were passed in the dying days of his government: in the Constitutional Reform and Governance Act 2010, known as CRAG. That act put regulation of the civil service on a statutory footing, as well as parliamentary scrutiny of treaties. Despite that limited success, the overall trend over the last 30 to 40 years has been to make the prerogative more transparent, more accountable, and to reduce executive discretion through four main mechanisms. First, tighter supervision by the courts in landmark cases like GCHQ, the Fire Brigades Union case, and more recently Miller 1 and Miller 2. Second, through Parliament seeking greater control over war powers, treaties, and public appointments. Third, in the gradual process of codification into both soft law and hard law. And fourth, in the creation of a whole new cadre of constitutional watchdogs, each designed to regulate a particular aspect of the prerogative. I won't say more about the courts, but I'm going to go straight to the second mechanism, Parliament. Interest in the prerogative was sparked initially by the sustained campaign from 2004 onwards by the Public Administration Select Committee, PASC, chaired by Tony Wright, to tame the prerogative. It was then boosted by the support shown by Gordon Brown and further boosted by the series of votes on military deployments under the coalition government. But despite the breadth of PASC's initial campaign, it's only in relation to war powers, treaties, and public appointments that Parliament's made any impression. And some of those gains have been transitory, as we shall hear in due course from the other speakers. Next, codification. This has taken a variety of different forms in hard law and soft law. But even when the prerogative is regulated in statute, regulation is not necessarily much tighter. It depends on the content of the statute. A good example is Cragg, which codified the Ponsonby Rule on the ratification of treaties, but turned a weak convention into an equally weak, some would say even weaker, statute. The Fixed Term Parliaments Act illustrates a different kind of weakness, namely vulnerability to political change. At the time, the FTPA appeared to be a strong form of codification, abolishing the prerogative power of dissolution and transferring that power to the House of Commons. But the FTPA was rushed through with no attempt to build cross-party support, and come the 2019 election, both Labour and the Conservatives were committed to its repeal. That's since been implemented in the Dissolution and Calling of Parliament Act passed earlier this year, which has restored the prerogative power. The lesson is that codification needs to build consensus if it is to endure. The drafting of the Cabinet Manual, which occurred at the same time as the Fixed Term Parliaments Act, adopted a very different consensus-building approach, with a draft published for consultation, followed by scrutiny by 3 parliamentary committees before the final version was published in late 2011. The Lords Constitution Committee has called for a similar process before the Cabinet Manual is revised, something the Cabinet Secretary Simon Case has promised will happen before the end of this Parliament. Finally, constitutional watchdogs, the fourth strand to tighter regulation. This is a novel development which I think is not sufficiently recognized. 5 different prerogative powers are now regulated by specialist watchdogs, all of them created in the last 30 years. Because of the limitations of time, let me give just one example, public appointments. Those are now regulated by the Commissioner for Public Appointments, the office recently held by Peter Riddle, the House of Lords Appointments Commission, which has been going 20 years, and the Judicial Appointments Commission, which has been going just over 15 years. There's continuing debate about the independence of these various watchdogs, with the Committee on Standards in Public Life pressing for some of them to be given greater security and stronger powers being put on a statutory basis. Now, I had hoped to say something about the equivalent of prerogative powers in other countries, but my 5 minutes are up, so perhaps we might be able to come back to that in questions. Thank you very much.
Certainly. Amazing, Robert, to stick to 5 minutes when you've published so many pages and thousands of words on these topics. Thank you very much. Let's pass over to Arabella now, who I think is going to speak about some of the international aspects and might unpack for us what Cragg is and what the Ponsonby Rule is. Arabella.
Thank you. Yes, indeed. And thanks to the Constitution Unit and Meg and Robert in particular for inviting me. Apologies if I have to leave a little early. It's our work Christmas party, so there might be jollification outside as well. So congratulations to the authors for this for their book and report and so on, which is a huge achievement. And I'm particularly pleased that it includes a detailed exploration of the treaty power, because that's something that's often missing from texts on broader constitutional and political matters. as my colleague Mario Mendes has identified. I've long considered that it's something well worth exploring for itself. We're finding that domestic law and regulation and rights in a huge range of areas are increasingly constrained by potentially permanent treaty commitments. But it also illustrates many broader issues, not just in relation to prerogative powers, but also about control of parliamentary time, effective scrutiny, delegated powers, devolution, all sorts of things. So in my 4.5 minutes, I'm going to just talk a little bit about the balance of power, the barriers to greater parliamentary involvement, and give a few thoughts for the future. So on the balance of power, in every country, the treaty power is shared to some degree between government and parliament, because the importance of the prerogative or the treaty power for the government needs to be balanced against other important constitutional principles like democratic accountability and the rule of law. And over time, as it says in the book, the factors to be weighed upon that balance have been altered. The treaties chapter shows how Parliament's treaty role has waxed and waned in the UK over recent centuries. And even now, treaties aren't the exclusive domain of the executive, as some would have us believe. But Parliament's role is still comparatively weak. The vast majority of written constitutions require parliamentary approval of all or some treaties for particular categories. And then even in other countries where the executive's treaty powers are dominant, like Canada, New Zealand, and Australia, which we'll probably hear about from Philippe, perhaps, have some really helpful examples for us. And yet the UK courts still cite parliamentary scrutiny as a justification for continued exclusion of treaty powers from their scrutiny in judicial review, without considering its effectiveness. And we saw that just this week on the Western Sahara case where the High Court gave a judgment on Monday. So on barriers to effective parliamentary accountability, why has Parliament done little to adapt its treaty role, apart from a handful of select committees, notably the new Lords International Agreements Committee? Well, there's a great deal of unfamiliarity with treaties and why they matter. The Parliament's treaty role is very late and very weak. The CRAG that Robert mentioned, the Constitutional Reform and Governments Act, as he said, encapsulated one aspect of the century-old rule on publication of treaties, but it didn't do anything to improve scrutiny. Parliament voted against increasing its own powers in relation to trade treaties and then complained about having no say. There's perhaps a reliance on debating implementing legislation instead of debating the treaties, but of course that's not the same thing. There's a huge lack of information about treaties and impact assessments, and a lack of staff resource to mitigate that lack in Parliament. So a few thoughts for the future. Obviously, I'm coming from the point of view that the prerogative shouldn't trump accountability, working for an access to justice organisation. And while parliamentary approval would be the single most effective reform, so at the moment there's no requirement for parliamentary approval of treaties. And introducing that would provide the incentive for the government to be inclusive and transparent as well as accountable, and for Parliament to do more of a job. But I think we're really unlikely to see that change in the short to medium term, or even providing more time to debate treaties. Although the PASC's successor, the Public Administration Constitutional Affairs Committee is doing an inquiry at the moment that might make recommendations like that. So I think we need to keep making the argument for why good scrutiny is in the government's interests, and why it should be more transparent. There should be more resources for effective scrutiny in Parliament. There could be a much better understanding of how to use treaty arguments effectively in domestic litigation. And we had a session on that recently with Shahid Fatima and Paul Luckhurst at the PLP annual conference. importantly, I think we really need to develop a new discipline of UK foreign relations law, writing and teaching. And this chapter, I think, makes an important contribution to that. In January, I'm holding a workshop on treaty and foreign affairs power and the Constitution with the University of Essex. So we're hoping that that will come up with some more ideas and incentives for developing that new discipline and for researching and writing on it. So watch this space. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Arabella, also beautifully to time. We're going to pass to Philippe next, which allows us, I guess, to maintain the international theme a bit by talking about the war power and maybe broaden out a little bit comparatively to, I don't know what you want to say, Philippe, but you might want to talk about that in other countries as well as the UK. Go ahead.
Thanks very much. And thank you for everybody who's participating today. It's a pleasure to be here. The war prerogative, and I'll use this just as a shorthand for what could also be described as the defense power. So I'm going to discuss them together, although some may break that apart, and I'll explain why that's important. But the war prerogative, or the defense power, has proven quite resilient. And this is perhaps the most resilient of the prerogative powers. And this is somewhat strange given the history of the prerogative. So as we know, the 1689 settlement identifies the prerogative to maintain a standing army. It terminates that prerogative. And that is one of the main prerogative powers of the Crown that is terminated or abolished in the 1689 settlement. So one would expect, and this, I believe, has planted a seed within thinking within the Westminster tradition, that the defense power, that the war prerogative is one that should or historically has belonged both to Parliament and to the executive. And indeed, I see that James Strong is on the call here today. His work looking at what Parliament's role was in the 18th century and how influential Parliament was within that time period has led others looking at the war prerogative to make the point that for some time, quite a bit of time, both the legislature and the executive were involved in what we would now consider to be the defense power and military affairs. However, as with many other prerogative powers, and we can perhaps get into this discussion in the question period, there was a bit of a waxing and waning, such that by the time you get to the 19th century, the prerogative dies down somewhat, likely on account of the European peace that's occurring after the Napoleonic Wars. But within the colonies, the prerogative comes back and actually has quite a bit of presence, particularly in the military realm. And I'm thinking here, if you look at the Constitution or the British North America Act of 1867, we have effectively a strange codification of the prerogative of the defense power with the command-in-chief power that's granted to the Queen in Canada and later in Australia. So an interesting hybrid model of the defense power. Perhaps most interesting is in the 20th century, and with the First World War in particular, the prerogative effectively gets revived and expanded. And this is where that distinction between the war prerogative and the defense power becomes important. Because on the one hand, although the United Kingdom may not be engaged in active hostilities, it is understood that it can do certain things within the ambit of the defense power that go beyond apprehended conflict. So you'll have the establishment, for instance, of the intelligence services through an extension of the defense of the realm prerogative as it's understood. Because they belong, in some sense, legally speaking, to the military, it is understood as an extension of that power. And well into the 20th century, the intelligence services are effectively being understood to be an extension of the defense of the realm power. So the prerogative seems to, although we always say that the prerogative can't expand or new prerogatives can't be created, the defense power tends to be quite fluid and it can be used in various ways. After the Second World War, the war prerogative becomes almost, one could argue, effectively a type of foreign affairs prerogative. Because the military is used in so many ways that is less or below the threshold of conflict, and yet still used as a tool of British foreign policy. And in that sense, if we're looking at it historically, one could argue that if you want to understand the lineage of the defense power or the defense prerogative, it looks less like the standing army prerogative that was abolished and looks much more like the prerogative over the Royal Navy, which was never removed. So the use of the armed forces in various capacities to advance British foreign policy is really the lineage that we see after the Second World War and well into the post-Cold War period. And so when we're comparing the defense power, the focus has often been on that standing army role and the fact that Parliament exercised control over it, when in reality, well into the 20th century, it looks a little bit more like the history of the naval power. Post-Cold War, as Robert details in his book, there is greater efforts to curb the prerogative, and that takes off quite significantly post 9/11 with the Iraq War debate. And what is the situation that we're in today? As both James Strong and Gavin Phillipson, who are also on the call here, have pointed out, there is a fragile convention of parliamentary approval in the United Kingdom. And I would say it's really, I don't even know if I would call it a convention anymore. It seemed very strong after the Syria vote in 2013, but Theresa May has somewhat, one could argue, diluted it or made it less certain about the exact boundaries that it belongs to. And it's unclear where that is heading in the United Kingdom today. All efforts to put it on a statutory footing seem to have failed and are unlikely to succeed in the future. In Canada, as of 2006, there's a practice, I would call it practice, definitely not a convention, of consulting the House of Commons, but this has largely benefited the executive. The executive uses these votes not to secure actual parliamentary approval, but to share its responsibility with the lower house in order to blur responsibility for the action and to confuse people about who exactly is making the decision for unpopular deployments. In Australia, a joint parliamentary committee is now studying the question, so that will be quite interesting to see where that goes. And similarly, in New Zealand, there is some talk, if I understand correctly, of amending the New Zealand Defence Act to perhaps encroach upon the defence power or to put the deployment on a statutory footing, but that is unclear. The last thing I'll say quite briefly is simply that when the prerogative or the defense power has been displaced, it has often expanded the power of the executive, not limited it. So we always have to be aware of the fact that you may displace a royal prerogative and replace it with a statutory prerogative, in effect, that is far greater in terms of its authority. And so we always need to be aware of this fact, that we should not privilege form, statute versus prerogative, over substance. What is the actual power that we're granting the executive? And I find that much of the prerogative debate often gets mired in this formal debate as opposed to looking at the substantive issue at hand. Thank you.
That's terrific, Philippe. There's lots of things I'd like to ask you, and I'm sure the audience feel the same. And thank you for pointing out that we have a very expert audience with us. And if any of the experts or indeed any of the non-experts are formulating questions in their minds, I would encourage them to start thinking about putting them into the Q&A function for the question time, which will follow. Let me pass finally to Peter, who I think will discuss more domestic uses of the prerogative.
Thanks, Meg. Yes, I was inclined to begin by, and now for something completely different, because that's what it'll be. I mean, I don't want to encroach at all on the fascinating contributions by the previous speakers. And really, I feel I'm acting as providing a large footnote onto Robert's chapter dealing with constitutional watchdogs and appointments. I mean, it's an excellent book and study. So I just want to perhaps highlight one or two contemporary issues on that. The first one I want to make is that because there's been a lot of controversy over appointments in the broader sense, from the House of Lords to public appointments and so on, under the Johnson government, people focus on that, but tend to forget there has been a massive change, as Robert's chapter brings out so clearly, in the last 30 years, really since the Nolan report. The watchdogs he sets out did not exist then. And we have both a codification of various strengths and of watchdogs, which were just not there at all. And on the appointments area, it really was on the whole range of things, from judges to a wide range of other appointments. It was a tap on the shoulder. There was very little process involved, and one shouldn't underrate the extent of change. The first point I want to underline is, well, when one looks at constitutional watchdogs, there is a real spectrum. I mean, you've got the hard one, which again Robert brings out, of the Judicial Appointments Commission, which is in some respects a model to be looked at in other areas. And it's set up by statute. It's got very strong powers to operate, and it's been pretty effective in its operation. I mean, there are arguments about the range of judges appointed, but in terms of fairness and probity. Then you've got, and I held that office for 5.5 years, the Public Appointments Commissioner, not set up by statute, set up by order in council, and also applied to several of the other constitutional watchdogs. And hence that's now being reflected in a private member's bill in the Lords, which wants to put them on a statutory basis. So there is a big range there. The second point I want to make is that all these bodies are on the whole advisory. That when one looks at the balance between the executive using its prerogative powers and the new bodies, yes, there has been a change in the last 20 or 30 years, but that all the bodies essentially advise. They can be overruled. We've seen this with the House of Lords Appointments Commission, with the even when it went public, and it's done a certain amount privately, even when it public and said that Lord Cruddas should not be appointed, Boris Johnson as Prime Minister overruled, and nothing happened, and Lord Cruddas is popping up in the Lords and enthusiastically backing Boris Johnson. That's part of it happens. In other cases, the role of the constitutional watchdogs is essentially what a process. That was my job on appointments. I didn't pick anyone, and all I could do was try and ensure the process was reasonably fair. But the decision making lay with ministers, and I think it's very important in looking at the role of the watchdogs. The same applies to the advisory body on business appointments. In other words, what ministers and solicitors do after leaving office. All it can do is advise, and its own chairman, a former Tory cabinet minister, Lord Pickles, openly admits its weakness in that respect. So I think we've got to bear in mind that advisory nature, and that there is an underlying tension there. And one of the interesting things in recent debates has been a pushback by the current government, and I emphasize current government. One's got to be very careful in terminology about governments in the UK in the last few months, of ministers in the Sunak government have essentially asserted ministerial prerogatives, notably in something Meg's very interested in, which is the Private Members Bill to strengthen the House of Lords Appointments Commission. There, they basically said, this is a matter for the Prime Minister. We don't want a stronger watchdog, despite a private member's bill backed by 25 of the 27 peers who spoke on a second reading, including most of the Conservatives who spoke. And that's an example of it. A further illustration, not directly in the appointments area, but allied to it, is resistance to strengthening the independent advisor on ministerial interests. And there is that sense that the executive is reluctant to surrender its remaining prerogative powers and accept a strengthening of independent regulation and indeed accountability to Parliament. I mean, perhaps we might come on to that later. The final point I want to make is in looking at appointments, how patchy the system is. I regulated a few thousand, it sounds a lot, but in practice it isn't as significant as it sounds, appointments to arm's length bodies. I won't get into the terminology of it, but everything from the BBC to local health boards and indeed what used to be called prison visitors, independent monitoring boards, which and parole boards. This is the non-executive members. But one of the things which hit me is how many are unregulated. Because one of the interesting developments has been that ministers have created a lot of directly appointed people who are not regulated. We've had czars, we've had looking at specific interests, we've had a whole number of advisors of various kinds, often on fairly short-term contracts, directly appointed by ministers who are regulated by no one. They don't count as civil servants. They're not covered by the Civil Service Commission, but they equally are not covered in my old job. So that is something which I think does need attention. We don't know how many there are and what they do. So whilst I would strengthen, and again we might come to that in questions, the way constitutional watchdogs apply, how they're appointed and how they function. I'd also want to know, and I think one of the real problems at present is we just don't know enough about appointments and what ministers do. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Peter. Now, it's my role to remind you again to start sending in your questions. Now you've heard the opening remarks from all of the speakers. Obviously, we've covered some aspects of the prerogative in the opening remarks. There are other things covered, particularly in the book, but also in the report that haven't been very much mentioned. like the dissolution and prorogation of Parliament, giving royal assent to legislation, regulating the civil service, the issuance of passports. If you want to get the panel onto any of those topics, then do raise them in questions or go ahead and ask questions related to the things that we've already heard about. While a few questions are coming in, let me put some questions to the panel. And I should just remind the audience, we're only running for an hour today. So we've got about half an hour for discussion all in all until 2:15. I wonder, this may be an unfair question, or rather a difficult question, but it most obviously goes to Robert and maybe to Philippe, who's done a lot of thinking about this comparatively, but other members of the panel free to chip in. This is all about sort of constraints on executive power and where to draw the line, and the encroachment upon executive power, which seems to be slightly in the UK going 2 steps forward, 1 step back. It covers a lot of different areas. Are there any sort of general principles that ought to apply to where to draw the line in terms of what the executive can do without parliamentary approval or oversight? Or is it just too disparate for that? Do different sort of principles apply in different areas? Robert, do you have thoughts on that?
I'll offer some thoughts. You're right, it is a hard question. We tried to answer it in a chapter in the book where we looked for equivalents of the prerogative in the constitutions of 6 other countries, all of them with written constitutions. And we chose 3 monarchies, 5 countries that were parliamentary systems, and 1 presidential system. So our comparators were Norway, Denmark, Japan, which were the 3 monarchies, and then Germany, France, and the United States. And those are mainly countries with pretty modern constitutions. So we thought this was a fair test to see how modern constitutions define the equivalent of prerogative powers, which very broadly speaking, you might call reserve powers, powers that grant the executive a high degree of autonomy. And interestingly, in some instances, we found those other countries, the executive enjoys more autonomy than that enjoyed by the Crown or the government here in Britain under the prerogative. I mean, just to give a smatter of examples, the French president and the Danish prime minister have open-ended powers to dissolve parliament, which are frequently exercised. And taking the power to veto legislation, royal assent to legislation, which our chapter concluded in the UK, in effect, is now defunct. We concluded royal assent is now automatic once a bill is passed through all its stages in Parliament. But contrast the German president and the American president, perhaps the American example is better known, both have powers to veto legislation. And in both cases, those powers are regularly exercised. And on military intervention, Philippe may be able to talk better about this, but in France and America, the president has considerable latitude to authorize military intervention without the assent of Parliament or Congress. Rather greater powers, I think, than in the Commonwealth countries that Philippe looked at.
Thank you, Robert. It's always refreshing to hear those things, because I think we have a tendency to sort of think ourselves exceptional in the UK. And very often that's not the case. Philippe, do you have any thoughts on general principles? And I was also going to ask you, this might connect, where are the debates internationally about constraining these kinds of powers? You mentioned a couple with respect to the war power, which was very interesting. I wonder, are there sort of hot debates happening in other countries about constraints upon other similar kind of executive powers to the prerogative, or indeed the prerogative itself?
Right. I'll start with the first question on general principles. And here I would encourage everyone and interested in this subject, and just to build on Robert's point, Westminster states are not necessarily all that different from other liberal democracies. And it's better to treat the power in those senses than it is to treat the royal prerogative as some special thing that only exists within a Westminster system and that is just naturally going to be abolished of its own accord. And I would go back historically when trying to classify the powers first. If you go back to the debates of the 17th century in particular, there's a distinction made between the ordinary prerogatives of the monarch and the absolute. And that absolute wasn't referencing absolutism. It was referring to powers that belong to the sovereign as it pertains to the reasons of state and matters of state. And if you're able to make that distinction, you can start to see there's a difference between the sovereign owning swans and being able to go to war. And once you identify that there are certain things that pertain to the underlying functions of the executive, then you start to get a better sense of which powers is it that we're talking about. And then what I would encourage, and I think Robert touches on this in his book, the real question we have to start asking is less how to get rid of these powers, as it is what powers should the executive have and subject to what control. So if we can shift the debate from less about we must get rid of these powers or put them on the statutory footing, and more flip the question and say, what do we want the executives to be able to do, and what's the justification for that power? And as Robert says, in a number of other countries, there is no simple model. So presidential republics will give quite a bit of plenary power for the defense power in particular to their presidents. And other countries will also share the Westminster tradition's emphasis on executive discretion. But there's quite a few different models, and we can discuss what that might look like. In terms of international debate, it is a matter that comes up. Australia and New Zealand were quite a bit more developed in terms of regulating the treaty power. They did it much earlier than Canada and the United Kingdom. So there are good examples of deep parliamentary involvement through their committees. But they have been slower than Canada and the United Kingdom in terms of dealing with the war power. But they are now moving ahead on this. And it may be that they will come from behind and actually go much further than Canada and the United Kingdom, precisely because they can learn from our experience, and in particular, learn from the fact that it didn't succeed in Canada and the United Kingdom. It did not lead to a displacement. It did not lead to the type of regulation one would expect. So it is a live debate. It's just discussed a bit differently, I would argue, outside of the United Kingdom, because it has less of the royal connotation. And there's even here, nomenclature is important. In Canada, we refer to it as the crown prerogative. And I know that's a slight difference, but the minute you take away the royal, it makes it more about the state, the executive, and less about the monarch, and less antiquated as a result.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I think we've got a question on that, actually. Arabella wanted to come in, and let me throw another question to you. So come in on what you wanted to, Arabella, but there was one last question I was going to try on the panel before we go out to questions. We're all, in effect, parliamentary specialists on this panel, but there have been a number of mentions, and Arabella made one of them, of Parliament, in effect, having an opportunity to take a power from the executive and not taking it. And of course, with respect to the dissolution and calling of elections, dissolution of Parliament, calling of elections, I've forgotten the name of the bill, the overturning of the Fixed Term Parliaments Act, who would have guessed that Parliament would be given a power to control something that the executive was previously controlling, and then when asked by the executive to give it up again, would readily do so. So I think there's a question, does Parliament want these powers? Is there a problem at the Parliament end of not trying to assert itself over the executive? Arabella.
Thank you, Meg. So I was just going to say, from the comparative point of view, talking about the sort of principles that might inform thinking about where the balance lies. There's a really interesting study about parliamentary approval of treaties that identified the kind of most common categories where parliamentary approval is required across the world, and those were where they modified domestic law, concerned domestic spending, or were on human rights or trade. And I think that those are quite neat, and a quite neat way of seeing where parliaments might want more control. On the opportunity to take power and not taking it, I worked at the House of Commons for a long time, and I spent the last few years of that trying to build enthusiasm and for taking on greater, but what I felt were existing powers, but using them and perhaps taking on more powers for scrutinizing treaties. And there was a huge amount of resistance, and I identified some of the reasons in my comments earlier about why that might be. I suppose, yes, not just resistance, but sort of a passive state on it. But I think it's also important to think about when those opportunities came, how much political capital did people have to rebel at the time? And for the trade treaty, that was certainly the case, that people had other priorities, that they used their power to or discretion to rebel in other areas, and there was just so much at that time that they didn't for that particular area.
Thank you. And then Peter finally wanted to come in, and then we'll pass over to Lisa for some audience questions.
Yeah, I mean, on that point, I mean, I think one of the troubles is referring to Parliament almost as a collective body, which it isn't. It's an executive and a potential executive. And I think that one always has to bear that in mind too, quite strongly, that there's always resistance from the executive to making their life more difficult. And I think that should always be borne in mind. One of there's also, I mean, I agree with Arabella, the sense that there's limited both capital and energy to pursue issues. And one of my frustrations, for example, I found as appointments commissioner, was I tried to interest select committees in appointments. Both for, I mean, they had a formal role in pre-appointment hearings for a limited number of very important appointments. And some of those they treated just as pro forma tick box, others they took more seriously. But I felt that they could have taken a much more active role on appointments, but they were reluctant to do so often. And partly for the reasons Arabella says. Also, there's resistance from the executive to give Parliament a stronger role for perfectly understandable executive reasons. But the slightly depressing thing is sometimes the opposition will formally say, oh, yes, we want to strengthen it. But then they're thinking, you know, behind the opposition whips is, do we want to make our life more difficult if we're in government? And one shouldn't ignore that factor in that. But I certainly found that you're quite right, that there is sometimes resistance to doing that. And I think actually, if just very, very briefly, on the example you gave, Meg, of taking away the role in dissolution of Parliament, I wonder if there will now be a further reflection on that, since, as we know, there was a discussion of that in July, and it could have turned into a horrible mess. But fortunately, it didn't do so on Boris Johnson thinking about a possible dissolution. And that would have created, it didn't happen, but I think perhaps there need to be further reflections on perhaps the Commons' role in dissolutions.
Right, yeah, agree with you. Let's go over to Lisa, and she can field us some questions from the audience.
Great, thank you. And thank you everyone for your questions. We're going to aim to get 2 rounds in if possible. And we'll start with some questions on specific aspects of the prerogative, and then comment on in our next round to some broader questions, particularly about the role of the monarchy. So we'll start with Gavin Phillipson, and then James Strong. And then I am going to pose an anonymous question about treaty making.
Okay, and we've got Gavin has joined us on the screen. There you go, Gavin. Ask your question. Welcome. We can't hear you. We're not hearing Gavin. Do we have James Strong? Maybe Gavin needs to fiddle with his microphone or something. James.
And I should have said, James, sorry, I was thinking specifically of your question on war powers, if I didn't say that already.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yep.
So my question, I want to say in response to Philippe's comment, I've rolled back myself from talking about a War Powers Convention in the UK setting, and that's a bigger thing. To what extent has the fragmentation of warfare, so the rise of non-state and quasi-state actors, as well as the increasing importance of, for example, the cyber domain, disrupted what was historically quite a simple balance of power between Parliament and the Crown when it came to war powers? Thank you.
Very good question. Gavin, do you want to have another go? We're not hearing you. It could be that Lisa needs to read your question.
Yep. Gavin has just written in to suggest we do just that. So
yep.
Gavin's question, as you know, in the UK third direction case, the Court of Appeal thought that prerogative was one or both of the war powers and or the prerogative of keeping the Queen's peace. I was struck by Philippe's point that the establishment of the intelligence service is generally seen as an extension of the war or defence prerogative. I wonder if you could do a better job than the Court of Appeal and say more specifically than it did, which prerogative you'd see as the source of MI5.
Goodness.
Yeah.
Then you had a third question, Lisa, that you were going to give us.
Yes, and an anonymous question for Arabella. You mentioned briefly the role of the devolved institutions in the question of foreign affairs and particularly treaty making. And I wondered if you could say a little bit more about the issues you think this poses, and particularly in light of the suggestions from the Brown Commission this week that Scotland might see its role changed, and the specific mention of a role for the Scottish Parliament in that.
Very interesting. Let's go to Arabella first, because I think she's trying to leave to get to a Christmas lunch. So come in on whichever of those questions you fancy, Arabella, and then I'll pass to others on the panel.
Thank you. So on the question of the devolved institutions, I think there's been a certain recognition of the need to involve the devolved executives in treaty making, and there was a long-standing, although not particularly effective, I think, agreement, interinstitutional agreement about that. But what the one of the main issues is that the executives have a responsibility to implement, the executives and legislatures have a responsibility to implement international law entered into by the UK government, but they've got no power over what that is. And the devolved legislatures obviously can only hold to account their executives, and so their powers depend on the extent to which the UK government has shared its power or included them in its own treaty making. So they're at two removes from the power itself, and yet having a really important role to play in implementing and enforcing those obligations. It's really hard to see what can be done about it. The Lords International Agreements Committee has had this on its mind for some time, and they've reached out. And some of Wales in particular has got its own kind of mechanism for scrutinising treaties, but it's really hard to see what impact that can have, given the distance between them and the actual power. Thank you. I am going to go now, so apologies to everyone. And,
thank you. Well, thank you so much for coming, and enjoy your Christmas lunch. And
thank you very much.
We will continue. Philippe, would you like to go next? I think at least one of those war powers questions was directed intentionally at you, and I'm sure you will have thoughts on both.
Right. So I think both of them are answerable in somewhat the same manner. Part of the difficulty is how we're defining the prerogative. And I would suggest that there's two different ways of viewing. You have one view, which we find in works by Sir Matthew Hale, which we find in Chitty, which we'll find in Claude and in Blackstone, that treats the royal prerogative as distinct sets of powers belonging to the royal dignity that are very specific and can be bucketed, and you can identify them. And when you see it that way, then you have difficulty trying to understand how modern uses of it make sense within those older buckets that we've established, where our sources are either 17th century or 18th century, and we then try to do some mental gymnastics to understand how contemporary statecraft aligns with those very old buckets. The other one is the Diceian view, which is effectively, and I would suggest that Dicey's influence post-First World War is understated in terms of how we understand the prerogative. And people tend to seize on the Diceian notion of a residual power, but that can be understood in two ways. It's either as antiquated and therefore going, or it simply means the executive can do whatever the executive needs to do that hasn't been provided for under statute. And when you understand it in those terms, then we look a lot more like other liberal democracies that have this notion of the executive power. And therefore, to Gavin's question and to James's question, if you understand it in that sense, almost in a Lockean sense, right? The power to do what is necessary for the public good. Then you start to make a lot more sense of how the power was understood in the 20th century. It effectively has expanded, owing to the Diceian definition, to meet the requirements of modern statecraft. And so in the intelligence realm, it ends up being this new amorphous that we basically created called the defense of the realm prerogative, the peace prerogative, whatever it is that you want to call it. And it therefore ends up filling all these gaps that statute and the efflux of time has not allowed us to do. And by the same token, to answer James' question, This is why I would suggest that if we want to understand the scope of the contemporary defense power, it's better to look at the history of the Royal Navy than it is the history of the Army. The Navy could be used in many different ways to respond to lots of different types of situations. And effectively, that's how we're thinking about the defense power in our contemporary thinking. It can deal with cyber. It can deal with non-state actors. It can deal with peace deployments. It can deal with training, whatever it is. It ends up becoming simply the use of the armed forces in the interests of the state. And I would suggest that that's where we're having difficulty, because we're still viewing it, in a sense, through the Hale, the Blackstone, the Chitty, as opposed to this larger sense of where it's developed.
Thank you. Robert, Peter, we want to get another round in, but you may want to come in on these questions briefly.
Quickly, if I may, I'm going to give a broader answer to Gavin's question. And that's a big success story about codification of what previously were prerogative powers. And I'm talking about the intelligence agencies. Because until only about 25 years ago, MI5, MI6, and GCHQ all operated in the dark, under the prerogative. And that caused difficulties for the agencies themselves. And towards the end of that time, the heads of the agencies were themselves crying out to have a statutory foundation. And that happened from memory, 2, possibly 3 acts of parliament for each of the intelligence agencies. They now have their own dedicated committee, the Intelligence and Security Committee. So there's much tighter scrutiny. And they also have a dedicated watchdog, whose name has changed over the years. I was trying to look it up. I think the watchdog is now called the Investigatory Powers Commissioner, and there are also judicial commissioners. So in the intelligence sphere, this is now closely regulated by statute. Unlike the story on treaties, it's a pretty effective statutory regime and much, much tighter scrutiny than existed before. Much more briefly, in answer to James Strong about the changing nature of modern warfare, I think it's been one of the difficulties for the convention to keep up with very rapidly big changes in modern warfare. Think of drone strikes, think of cyber warfare that James mentioned. Think now of our huge involvement in military assistance to the Ukraine, which, so far as I know, has not been authorized by a single parliamentary debate. Yet arguably, the government's support for Ukraine potentially places us more at risk than any number of individual drone strikes or airstrikes over Syria or whatever, where the debate was only 5 or so years ago.
Thank you, Robert. Let's go back to Lisa and have another round. We've got a diminished panel of 3, so we may just about be able to squeeze it in. Lisa.
Thank you. In the interest of hearing from as many people as possible, we're going to go first to Hilary Nartzler, who may turn out to be David, and I'm then going to summarise a couple of the fields of questions that have come in.
Well, Hilary Nartzler, is it you or is it a different Nartzler?
Can you hear me?
Hello?
Can you hear me?
Yes,
I'm
David.
so sorry to pretend to be that's something wrong with the machine. No, it was just to follow up on the naval question, which Philippe has raised, which has really shocked me. Is there any reason why the Royal Navy should be different to the other 2 services, or indeed security services? I mean, they get the annual vote for their numbers, the same as for Air Force and Army services. But I know they're set up under the prerogative, and apparently they don't even take an oath of, is it right? They don't take an oath. So they're different from the Army and the Air Force for those ridiculous historical reasons. But you get these potentially highly controversial deployments, say to the Black Sea or the South China Sea, and nobody asks Parliament whether that's a good idea. Whereas, as Robert was saying, that's at least like arms to the Ukraine. These are at least as perilous as any military or drone or Air Force undertaking. So I just wondered if someone, I'd never thought of it, why the Navy difference? Or not why, but whether that's sustainable.
Thank you. And Lisa, you were going to summarise the others.
I am. So the first question has been posed by a couple of people, and in general, it asks how far can convention temper the prerogative? And this has been brought up specifically with reference to dissolution. Do we think that the Lascelles principles still apply? And one questioner has cited the recent Financial Times article, which people may have seen, which suggested there was a degree of concern and indeed wargaming by some senior officials to try and work out what the monarch could do should a dissolution request come from an embattled prime minister. And the second broad question is again about the role of the monarch. What's the effect of the royal dimension of the royal prerogative? Could these things be redefined as ministerial prerogatives? The report refers to the monarch as the ultimate guardian of the constitution with deep reserve powers in the case of constitutional emergencies. What are these powers and should they sit with the monarch?
Great, thank you. Peter, you sat the last round out. Would you like to go first on this one?
Yes, I mean, just very briefly on one touch thing of the last round. I was a member of the detainee inquiry, which looked at the behaviour of the intelligence services in relation to rendition and Guantanamo. I was struck, and this was after all legislation, leaving aside the specific controversies, but how much these were legal issues and how seriously the agencies took their legal responsibilities. Just to underline Robert's point, I mean, it was very striking. That on the prerogatives, I think, I mean, Robert clearly defined what are residual ones. I think it's very unfortunate that the repeal of the Fixed Term Parliaments Act left that ambiguity. To go back to Lisa quoted, in fact, Seb Payne's book, which was serialized in the FT, on this discussion between the cabinet secretary and then the Queen's private secretary over if there had been a request. And would in fact one of the answers was the Queen wouldn't answer the phone, which sounds absurd. But I think it does show a loose end, and it was a loose end which was spotted during the passage of the bill through the Lords, and indeed some quite eminent members of the Lords who had been involved themselves in it, including Lord Butler, the kind of doyen of ex-cabinet secretaries. He raised this specific issue very clearly, and the government kind of brushed it aside, and when it eventually came to the vote, it was narrowly defeated. I think this needs to be revisited, not least because the basic principle is the monarch should not be brought into a controversial position, and I think that there was a danger of that, and I think that does need to be addressed. It's nothing to do with the monarch at all, but it's the potential embarrassment factor, which is at risk, and therefore I do think this point needs to be clarified, and it could be quite simply clarified with the House of Commons being given a simple majority vote on dissolution. It's never going to happen unless the majority wants it or unless there's a breakdown, but I think that would avoid the potential embarrassment factor.
Could I bring Philippe in now so that Robert can have the last word?
Very briefly on the Royal Navy, historically, why is it the way that it is? Twofold. The first, it was understood to be a significant source of state power, both under the Elizabethan and early Stuarts, but as importantly, even under the Commonwealth and Cromwell, that's really when the Navy expanded and became a significant tool of statecraft. So even in the anti-royalist camp, it was seen as a very significant tool for the English state. As importantly, when you move into the 18th century, unlike a standing army, a Royal Navy a Navy can't be used to suppress liberty. So the historical notion that you can't use that particular arm of the English state, which would allow the executive to do what is necessary to defend the English state, to advance its interest, but it does not do so at the cost of liberty for those within England. Now, of course, today that logic may not fit anymore. But what's interesting is that the use of the Royal Navy in that way aligns more with what we would consider to be the foreign affairs power. So if you were to deploy the Royal Navy to engage in active hostilities, you would likely, depending on the nature of the deployment, have the convention triggered of parliamentary involvement. But when they're doing things that fall below that threshold of conflict, protecting sea lines of communication, international trade, having a diplomatic presence, whatever it is, it falls within that very ambiguous foreign affairs power that most states leave somewhat unmolested within the executive. Finally, on the royal element, I think it is fair to say that, and this is a very interesting part of the prerogative debate. In the past, those that would have defended the royal prerogative would have said the monarch should not be involved. We don't want the monarch exercising this power. This power is exercised on the advice of ministers. But an odd turn has occurred where if you want to curb executive power now, you're hoping or arguing that the monarch should perhaps have more discretion in order to refuse advice in some cases. But that puts both sides in a very awkward position. Those who are defending the royal prerogative saying that effectively the monarch should have no role in it, which then becomes an executive power, not a royal prerogative. And those who are defending the monarch's role, who are effectively saying that the monarch should have a greater role in the British Constitution than Bagehot would have assumed in the late 19th century. So perhaps it is time to move beyond this and try and codify in some sense what belongs with the Prime Minister in a much clearer fashion and what belongs with the Commons, and to try and really bring to an end this notion that the sovereign is involved in these affairs. Because even when it comes to the power of appointing a Prime Minister, as we know, that prerogative has effectively been displaced by the reality of the political process. And there's always that risk that the monarch will be drawn in. And I think both Buckingham Palace and the Cabinet Office might arrive at a conclusion that it's time to move on, but we aren't there yet.
Thank you very much, Philippe. That's fascinating. Let me pass over to Robert for the last word. You might want to tell us what should happen next. And we have a new monarch, of course. Is it time to stop talking about the royal prerogative altogether?
Very little to add. But no, the reserved powers of the Crown are real, and the monarch is the ultimate guardian of the Constitution. And I'll give two quick examples. One on prorogation of recent memory. And if in future a Prime Minister were to make a questionable request for proroguing Parliament, the monarch now has very clear guidelines in the judgment of the Supreme Court in Miller 2, because Brenda Hale, the President of the Court, said very clearly, if the effect of prorogation is to prevent Parliament from carrying out its core function of scrutinizing the executive and holding the government to account, then that prorogation will be unlawful. And so the monarch's arm now is greatly strengthened in challenging any dodgy prorogation request. Second quick example, during the fevered Brexit debates, there was some speculation about formal votes of no confidence and some speculation in the press with possible briefings from Number 10 that if Johnson lost a no confidence motion, he might not stand down. And I'm in no doubt, and I said this at the time, that if he lost a formal no confidence motion and he refused to resign, then the Queen would have dismissed him. Because that, again, is a very important formal role of the monarch. We've referred to it not just to appoint ministers, but also to dismiss them. Final word on what's different about the Navy. I can't resist quoting Churchill when he was first Sea Lord. The Navy only understands three things: rum, sodomy, and the lash. So David, that's my answer to your question. Thanks, Meg, for a really good seminar.
I'm not sure we've ever ended one of our seminars on points such as those before. Thank you, Robert. Thank you so much to all of our speakers for your fascinating contributions, including Arabella, who has since left us. Thank you to all of the audience for attending. Thank you for your questions. Sorry if you asked a question and we didn't get to it. I suspect I'm talking to the converted here, but I hope we've whetted your appetite that the prerogative matters, and that we might want to think about reforming aspects of it. And if you want to explore more, I should have mentioned that Robert had a post on the Constitution Unit blog this morning summarizing the report. The report itself is available on our website to freely download. So have a look at that. And then if even that hasn't been sufficient for you, do think about buying Robert's book. Congratulations to Robert and his two co-authors on those two really important publications. As I said at the start, there's going to be a video of this event made available on our YouTube channel soon, and it will go out as a Constitution Unit podcast. Those in the audience will receive notification when it's available. So if you have enjoyed it, do please share that with your friends, family, and colleagues and encourage them to take a listen or to watch. If you're not already signed up for the Constitution Unit's events mailing list, do please do so in order to learn about our forthcoming events. Just go to our website, select Get Involved, and then subscribe in order to join our events mailing list. Our next event we're planning for January, we hope is going to be on the Brown Commission report, which has been mentioned, the report published by Gordon Brown to the Labour Party this Monday, which is very wide-ranging. We haven't got that organised yet, but we hope that there'll be news about it before Christmas or otherwise very shortly afterwards. So please watch our Twitter account and our website for that. And we hope to see some of you there. But until then, thank you very much, everybody, and goodbye.